Hello, everyone. Today with us, we have Kate Lupango, who is the co-founder and executive director of Animal Empathy Philippines. She has over 6 years of experience in farmed animal advocacy and has also co-founded Effective Altruism Philippines. To start us off, could you tell us a bit about what Animal Empathy Philippines does?
Yes, thank you. So Animal Empathy Philippines, we just started back in 2021. And our mission is we want to strengthen the farm animal advocacy movement in the Philippines. So by building community, capacity, and relationships. So our vision is we want a world where no animal will suffer due to humans.
Yeah, and in the Philippines, there are many other organizations like PAWS, AKF, and the Fish Welfare Initiative that do a lot of work.
Hmm.
So what's different about Animal Empathy Philippines, and can it work to help these other organizations as well?
Yes, we actually co-work with those organizations that you mentioned. So PAWS, AKF, and then Fish Welfare Initiative. So I think something that is very different for among us is like AAP is really focused on farm animals. Although in the Philippines there are emerging organizations that focus on animal welfare, but it's still on the companion animals. But we slowly like PAWS and AKF, they slowly also extending those campaigns that they have to also cater for farm animals. So such as PAWS, they have the better chicken options, and then AKF they have cage free. So we're now like joining forces to also maximize like the effort that we can do for the Philippines in terms with farm animals.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Animal Empathy Philippines works in community building. So after having spoken to a lot of
Mm.
organizations, some suggested that their big issue was a lack of funding. And I also talked to the managing
Mm.
director of Fish Welfare Initiative in India, and um, they said that it was a lack of talent. Why do you think that it might be a lack of talent in your opinion? And what do these organizations mainly need?
Yes, I think in terms with funding, definitely there's still limited as to funding Asian countries, organization as well. And talent, I would say it's because some of the people don't see this as a viable opportunities. And when we talk about animal advocacy, it's mainly about volunteers or like working in vet or agriculture. So one of the areas that we are focused in terms with community building is like we want to encourage like in terms with capacity building. So we want to encourage more Filipinos to use their current skills in terms with helping farm animals. So it doesn't have to be like, okay, you're already you can only volunteer. So there's like a lot of things. Maybe you're good, let's say, in economics, so you can do that in terms with helping farm animals, or even like if you're also good in research, because in the Philippines, very limited in terms with the research that we currently have as to focus on farm animal well-being or in terms with their rights as well.
Yeah, and how do you see yourself increasing the awareness of animal advocacy to attract talent? Because one of the things that really struck me was that
Mm-mm.
82.4% of Filipinos are on social media, which is a huge number, which means that it's so much more possible than ever to reach out to more people. So, how are you capitalizing on that opportunity?
Yeah, so that's actually a good analysis because we Filipinos very heavily use Facebook. So even like in the campaign that we currently have for animal empathy, that's also still focused on reaching through the platforms of Facebook. And one other way that we also capitalize that is since Philippines is an archipelago, that means like we're like 7,000 island in the Philippines. And we use social media, especially when we started because that's still lockdown. So there's still a COVID during that. Through the Facebook and the social media, we were able to capitalize in terms of getting people outside the city, especially those far away that we believe that has more accessible in terms with looking into farm animals, especially since there are backyard farmers still in the Philippines. So that's like an advantage for us because we got to extend not only those people that that can be in the city.
Yeah, and what's unique about the issues that Philippines faces regarding animal welfare? For instance, India has a lot of anti-cruelty laws, but its
Mm-mm.
big weak point is enforcement. And Japan finds it hard to get any reforms through their national government because the animal welfare movement is outcast and seen as
Mm-mm.
antithetical to whatever the government is asking for. And it's also really hard to protest there. So I'm curious to know what's different about the Philippines compared to the rest of the world.
Yes, it's kind of hard to answer because, like I mentioned, there's still limited information that we know. For example, if we don't have a concrete yet in terms of what really is the current welfare of majority of the farm animals in the Philippines. Although there are some already, there's several there like also some or organization that's working on those research, but it doesn't, yeah, it's not concrete yet. And I think another that is also different for the Philippines is, like I mentioned, like the location that we have. So we have uh both, like in terms with fish. So since like we're an archipelago, there's also a lot of fish production in the Philippines, as well as in terms with chicken and then pigs. So there's a lot of areas. And as to law, currently we have the Animal Welfare Act, but it's still about, yeah, companion animals. It's not extending to other types of farm animals. And that's also what we want to address in our organization. So we want to look more deeper in understanding what's the current situation. And there's a lot of barriers, like I've mentioned, not only in terms with location, there's also about behavior. So behavior and then perception of the Filipinos about it. And another then is the purchasing power. So sometimes more people in the Philippines are more accessible, or they see this as something like more cheap compared to more vegan products.
Yeah, and why should we do more work in the Philippines? So one of the things is that the population is definitely likely to grow, making it
Hmm.
a very large concern from an animal welfare perspective because more meat consumption, and therefore it's definitely important. But I'm also curious to know how it would work on the neglectedness and the tractability criteria.
Yes. So in terms of the neglectedness, there are still information that we don't know. For example, there are areas in the Philippines that is not accessible to social media, or there are other, like they have different practices. And one thing that I think somehow stand out with Philippines is that we have somehow significant numbers still of the backyard farmers. So the backyard farmers, for example, for pigs, these are like 1 to 20 pigs. And normally that's really on the back of their houses. So, but I think there is now more movement of having more commercial farms in the Philippines, particularly on, uh, I think on the chicken. Yeah. So that's something I think would be interesting to look into as to neglectedness, like the uh in terms with the connection of transitioning from backyard to commercial, and how we can actually address that and minimize that, and addressing in terms with the welfare of the animals.
Yeah, and this transition between backyard farming into commercial farming is a bad thing for animal welfare, right? Because it would
Yeah.
lead to like more farming of animals. Yeah. And one of the things that you pointed out is that there's a lack of information and research that
Mm.
happens.
Mm-mm.
What are the types of things that you would like to know about ideally in the Philippines?
Yes. I think we did this for example, we did this with the alternative protein. So in the alternative protein, the main idea there is a scoping report that try to understand where is Philippines right now in terms with L14. But it focused on three. So like the pillars, the plant-based, the cultivated, and then the fermentation. And based on that report, like we saw that majority of the Philippines are still on the plant-based. So that's one good information that we know that is like good in terms with leveraging what's the action that we need to take. And another thing that we, in terms of information that we are so interested to look into, is how people see, like farm animals in the Philippines. So there is a perception, do people know what really happening in the farm animals? And do one thing that we're also interested is, do people like Filipinos also know that they have the capacity to help? So that's, for us, it is also important, like putting the power or the capacity, that it doesn't have to be an organization or any expert, that actually you have a capacity to be able to help those animals.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you had produced a scoping report on alternative proteins. I'm very interested to know about what the culture surrounding food in the Philippines is. So is eating meat largely ingrained in people's minds? Because in India, there's a lot of vegetarianism, and in different countries, it's different. So what is it like in the Philippines?
Yes, it's, I would say it's still somehow similar with India or any Asian. Like food, especially eating meat, is part of our culture. So, for example, most of the feast or celebration that we have the lechon. So lechon is like the roasted pig. So that's the whole pig, and that's part of like a really big celebration for us. And also eating is like a form of social connection, right? So there's a lot of malls and restaurants here, and that's like the way we socialize and meet with other people. And I think another good to analyze is also, there are other, so also have like indigenous people. So the indigenous people here kind of use animals in a different way. So this is more on the rituals, and then in terms with religious sacrifice. So that's actually good also to, for us to look into, like how Filipinos use animals, not only in terms of, yeah.
Yeah, and is meat something that's eaten every day, or is it something that's eaten during these rituals or like special occasions?
For the indigenous people,
Yeah.
yeah, for the indigenous people, ye- I would say that depends, but I'm not sure. But uh, in indigenous people, particularly something that I've been looking into is like they eat pig if there's a celebration, and those meat is actually shared with the community. And then there are also, for example, chicken is something that they can eat like on a regular basis. So in terms of the hierarchy of meat, so pig has a more hierarchy compared to chicken for the indigenous people. But majority for the people here, also Filipinos in the Philippines, we consume meat in because this is very accessible. And then there's also a lot of canned goods that can be easily consumed.
Yeah, and that makes the need for alternative proteins in the Philippines really great. And so, on the alternative proteins itself, is the market for it going to largely cater to already existing vegetarian and vegan people, or do you think that it could, also displace meat for people who are, not necessarily vegans or vegetarians, but conventional meat eaters?
Yes, for now, um, the Filipino vegans here, we also have a very good number of like startup businesses that cater to vegans. And they are emerging big corporations, like there are meat industry that is moving to alt protein, particularly in the plant-based. So those actually are the two main company in the Philippines. And we saw that there's actually a big, not actually, like significant number of people who somehow consider more eating plant-based because of the accessibility. Because the corporation that I mentioned is they can cater to large supermarkets and stores, so that's why it's more accessible. And then one thing that we also, based on the conversation that we have from the government, is in terms with Filipinos are still using hybrid meat. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. But it's currently still being used uh, in the canned goods that is being manufactured here in the Philippines. So they kind of use it as substitute for meat. And I think that's the current practices also right now. But hopefully more companies would really move into more plant-based. And I think the another thing that they currently also doing is transition it to more Filipino dishes. So like we have more uh like suited for our taste buds. So that is easily consumed, whether it would be for breakfast or dinner, something like.
Yeah, and another question that I had is that Philippines is per capita GDP is something like 3,460 US dollars. And do you think that because the Philippines is relatively poorer than a lot of Western countries where consumers there themselves find meat substitutes more expensive, that the Philippines will find it hard to have a greater adoption of alternative proteins because it's expensive?
Well, one factor would be, yeah, I think one factor would be really the price. And another would be the accessibility. Because there are, for example, there are people who wants to shift, but it's a matter of the variety and then the accessibility. So for example, there are people who don't want to eat every time like the burger, the vegan burger or the vegan sausage. So they want more variety. And yeah, accessibility can still be a factor. If it would be also good. So one thing that also we look into is like more government support in terms with making research that is accessible for, let's say, for corporations or industry to kind of practice more in terms with maximizing like the produce that they have, or like more research in terms with developing good product. So yeah, but right now those are like the price and then accessibility can still be really a barrier for us. And I think also to add is the perception of eating plant-based or alternative. So it's still something really new to us. So uh it's not it's not commonly practiced like eating the alternative proteins.
Yeah, and you mentioned working with the government, which I found very interesting because in your report you had said that um, there is a concern with the protein supply in the country because of the growing population, an increase in
Mm-mm.
outbreaks of disease that affect chicken and pork supplies, rising meat prices globally, which make it less affordable. And all of this seems like a huge concern to even a government that doesn't care too much about animals, but just cares about the protein supply of their country. And so, has this been your main argument when talking to governments to get them to invest more in alternative proteins?
Yes, that's one part of it, but we I think one of the strategy that we do in terms with collaborating or talking with the government is trying to understand first what's the current things that they want to do. And that starts a conversation of whether, okay, so is there an other way to look into it? One example would be in in terms in terms with animal advocacy, in terms with animal welfare is we talk to organization like how can we better leverage in terms with the welfare of the animals, in particularly in farm. Although they want to do that, there's no information that they can rely in. So that puts also the barrier for organization for like the government to pass law. If there's like no concrete information, uh, it's hard to sell, or it's hard to talk into to the government. So that depends on, that's why I think in terms of my answer, that really depends on what the government would see value in terms with the agreement or like the collaboration that we want to look into. So I think another example that we're currently doing in terms with animal welfare is we have an ongoing research about understanding the welfare of pigs. Particularly, this would be on the province area, so not in the city. So how this, for example, current standards that we have in the Philippines really did in terms with the betterment of fish. pigs. And especially for backyard farmers, is it something, the standards is something that they can do easily, or like what are the barriers for the backyard farmers to not be able to do that? So if we see, for example, based on the report, there are certain gaps that we saw, for example, for backyard farmers. Based on the standards, it's hard for them to have this equipment because it's something that they cannot achieve, or they cannot purchase. Maybe the government can have a better alternatives in terms of the standards that they have. So those kind of things is kind of slowly what we're trying to incorporate and trying to work into the government, because we also saw that really important for us, an organization, to work together with the government in the industry as well.
Yeah, and when you say government, is this like local governments or is it like the national government? How do you like approach them?
So yeah, this is more on the departments, so department of the like agencies in the government. So for example, we have as to all protein, we're currently communicating in terms with DTI, so that's Department of Trade and Industry. So they actually holding in terms with, I think they have a research about plant-based in food industry in the Philippines. So they're trying to do a roadmap of what is the plant-based in the Philippines right now, and what are the things that can be done. And that's with DTI. And then we also have another one that we're currently also working together is in Bureau of Animal Industry. So they are under the Department of Agriculture. So those kind of organization we talk to. And yeah, there's also other we also tap into the academy. So the current research project that we have is that would be on a state university in the province.
Yeah, and I wanted to know a little bit more about exactly what alternative proteins in the Philippines would look like. And
Hmm.
so my next question is, in order for the growth of alternative proteins, at least with plant-based meat, which was the big thing that I think a lot of the government is focusing on, as well as the thing that seems to be the most promising. A lot of land is required for like soy
Hmm.
cultivation. And can the Philippines support that, given that a lot of its land is covered in mountains with like volcanoes and other things like that?
Yeah, that's definitely we still don't know yet. So other thing that we are looking into is what type of crop in terms with plant-based is good for the Philippines. So we currently have some crops. For example, we have mung beans that is largely also in the Philippines, and then there's like potatoes and uh, other things. So I guess it's also a question if what what crop would be plant is actually feasible in the land that we have. And then another also is we're trying to look into like the researchers that we have in the scoping report is to position where Philippines should be. Is Philippines more on the consumer as to plant-based, or is it really should be producing the plant-based? So that's also a good question to understand, but we don't have a concrete answer yet. Uh, yeah, but those kind of things we're looking into.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting point that you raised. We don't know if the Philippines should be on the consumer side or the producer side. And it's interesting to know like what country would be producing a lot of the raw materials that are needed for making the plant-based
Mm.
meat. And one thing I will say, at least in the India context, is that it looks like a lot of crops like pulses and millets seem to have a lot of promise. And I'm sure that it's different in the US. So it's like different countries have different crops that they deem most suitable for
Mhm.
alternative proteins. And I think also it should depend on what is the type of meat that we're trying to replace, because dishes are different. We're trying
Yeah.
to get the taste of that. And so I think it will be very like country specific, in my opinion. And I'm just really excited to see how this will like play out in the next few
Mm.
decades. So this is a lot of,
Yes, and
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I guess to also add, this is actually something that Filipinos are currently doing with the crops. So there are, for example, like in terms with some of, I, if I'm not mistaken, that would be banana. So banana, cassava, that's actually some of the crops that I've been trying uh to have it more in the plant-based or substitute to a more plant-based. So we already have some different crops that we are trying to do as plant-based. So another thing to consider is, yeah, what aside from the prescribed plant-based crop, is there other way or alternative crop that we can look into in terms with substituting, like the like you mentioned, like the texture or even the taste that we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this was a lot about like the Philippines and the alternative protein landscape there. I wanted to move into a few questions about you. So what got you started with
Sure.
animal welfare? Yeah, and effective altruism.
Sure. So I got interested with animal welfare through one of my friends. So we have a conversation when we are actually doing like a cleanup, like an ocean cleanup event. And and we had a conversation like that my friend is already vegan. So she's trying to explain to me what veganism is and why is it important. And what resonates for me is one of the values that I hold is compassion. So it made me realize like how I show compassion to people should also translate to my compassion to animals because they are the one who need the most. And she recommended that I should watch Earthlings. So that's one document that I watched, but I didn't finish it because for me that's the it's hard to watch. But from that I decided, okay, first I'll try to be vegetarian. So I try, okay, I think it's hard for me to shift to dairy free. I'll just go with vegetarian. But then I realized, okay, so what's really the purpose of for me transitioning in the first place? So it is more on really acknowledging that animals should not be exploited and should not be. So that's why I decided from that to really go vegan. And through that, so I have uh slowly transitioning into veganism from that I think back in 2017. And I've done several outreach. I volunteer with VegFest. And that's a good also for me opportunity to meet other vegans in the Philippines and then also look how they market like the meat in the Philippines. And then I also did some outreach that's specific for animal shelters in the animal shelters. And that's a good also opportunity for me to get to know more of those people and then also uh, see the situation for the animals. And then what leads me to EA is actually through William McCaskill TED Talk. So I was vegan. I'm already vegan that time, and then I saw what resonated for me is first is the cause area about global health and development, and then another would be on the animal welfare because those two cause area is what I really believe into and what I'm dedicated. And upon watching that TED talk, that made me realize that for me, I believe that Filipino is already compassionate, and we have a high volunteer rate in the Philippines. So I know that a lot of people already volunteer. So for me, the volunteer is already there, but it's just a matter of putting the effective, right? Putting the effective in terms of altruism. And after that video, yeah, so I try to look into if there are people in the Philippines who are interested or already know about effective altruism. So during that time, yeah, I was connected into with some Filipinos, but they're outside, so they are international. And And then that leads me to communicating with other EA in Asia, so particularly in EA Singapore. So Wang Yi is one of really one of the person who convinced me to start the EA Philippines, like the Facebook group. So through that Facebook group, I was able to meet Tanya and Brian, who is my two co-founders, and that's the time we officially launched Effective Altruism. So it's still, yeah, so it's still heavily on social media. So the success that we have for EA Philippines and AUP is still started from the social media. And yeah, so that leads me to build to building the effective altruism, and I get to know more about animal advocacy. And that's also the reason why I decided that if we should start a separate organization, like not only doing it in under EA Philippines, but a separate, because yeah, it there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in farm animals, and it would be good if there's like an organization that can start. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very inspiring story. Um, can you tell me a little bit about what a day in your life looks like?
Oh, okay. So my day looks like, that's a good question. So it kind of vary based on the concerns. But mostly as to work, so I do have meetings. So meeting like with the team. So we meet in terms like if there are projects that needs to be done, and then I check what is the status of those meetings. And then somehow I'm still very hands-on because we are a very small team. So currently there are four, four of us in the team that's working full time, and we want to also still hire more people. So my typical work is like, yeah, I check if there's like email, like the normal stuff, and then answer some concerns. And then depends on the day. That also depends on the project. So for example, uh, today what we did is like we did like a whole day meeting as to funding and reports. So that's the that's the that's the thing that we do for today. And then there are also some concerns about the registration. So because we're a newly established org, so there are like tax concerns and like remittances, government remittances that we currently doing. So there's some admin stuff. And then I also, I think the last before my meeting is we also did we also did a review on the proposal. So we have a proposal whether you should push into that, and then we decided if whether we want to support those proposals. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very busy day then. Um,
Yeah.
what advice do you have for others who want to start community building projects in Asia and other developing countries?
Yeah, I think community building is really a good start. That's where I also that's how I also started. And it's good to start with, you have to make sure that you have the right intention in starting the community building. It's not something that you see uh that you will have a full-time work right immediately. So because it's something like you want to try. So even for us, when we started animal empathy, it's not our full-time work. So this is something that we do alongside. So we have like the three co-founders, we all have full-time work. And the initial plan there is like, okay, I think we can do this in like a part-time. But we saw like the need of it. That's why we decided that we have to give up our full-time work. And another advice also is really invest on knowing the people. So it's not something like, okay, so there's like you have 20 people who go to your events and that's already a success. So you have to know the story behind those people who join and put the time that they have into your events or to whatever projects that you have. Because those people can really be a good connection in what you do. And then eventually those people will kind of network you with other people that they also know. So that's also how we do. That's why sometimes we have more connections because of the relationships that we have. And I think another also is in terms with community building, it's really focused on what you're trying to achieve. So for us, for example, we are very focus that it has to be Philippines. And then when we look into Philippines, okay, so which in the Philippines are actually neglected? So which are the advantage that we have and which are the disadvantage? That depends if we're talking about people or if we're talking about animals. And I think that's a good thing to look into, especially if they want to work in the farm animal movement. And then also talk to people that you think is not your ally. So like people that you think will not that would not agree with you. So for example, uh, some some community building or builder will not talk to, let's say, industry or something, or government, because they hate government. But like the way that we approach is we want to open ourselves with those kind of things. Like what would be the disagreement, or what would be the negative thing that they will say to us? Because if we're lucky, we'll be able to answer that and they would agree. So that's the best thing. But if not, that's an information for us. So maybe they're not the right people yet, or we don't have the information yet to be able to convince them. And I think as a community builder, you should have that kind of skills to know that, and have very different kind of hats, right? So if you're building a community, you're not only good in terms with marketing, social media, communications. You need also to have good connection with people, and somehow you also need to do some admin stuff, something like that, and organizing. So uh, community building is there's a lot of tasks, and there's a lot of heads that you need to put into. But that's a really good for me. That's a really good opportunity, and not all people can be fit for community builder. That's for me, because there's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, and community building is just so important, especially in animal welfare. Um, finding people who you can work with. I think it's also rewarding in that you're finding people who are, just as compassionate, just as caring, and dedicated towards animal welfare. So I know we like talked about a lot of stuff, but is there anything that you wish you were asked, anything that we didn't cover that you would like to talk about?
Okay. So, that's a good question. I'll be interested to, I guess, to talk more about the stories that we have in terms with the people, because as I mentioned, AAP is we want to cultivate a community of farm animal advocates. And I think it's good to highlight, like when we talk about community, we're not only talking about people who are vegetarian, who are vegan, or into vet. We have community members that actually farm. So we have those kind of raising rabbits. So actually in the Philippines, it's now transitioning to legalize the meat production in the Philippines. Unfortunately. So it's good because, like, I guess we kind of build animal empathy as something not intimidating for those people who are interested. So we receive a lot of different types of people. So like I mentioned, we have farmers, there are people within the government, and then there's like in terms with academe, and whether those farmers are raising farm animals or into crops as well. So although they have different concerns. So for example, uh, maybe the farmers would be concerned first on how can they have a better life for the animals that they currently raise, and that's a conversation that we have, and then eventually hopefully through the conversation we can encourage them to shift and to look into other uh, like other mode of livelihood. And then another is also like the students. So the students are very active. So especially whether it would be through high school, I think the youngest that we have is like high school and into our community. And they are interested. Okay, so for example, I have this time, so I can use this time to work into helping other things or something like that. And then another that's also interesting is, yeah, in terms of not having to separate it as something as a vegan. It's like for us, being vegan or vegetarian is not necessary or like a prerequisite to be part of the community. Because what's important for us is if you have interest in this space, so there's a lot of things that you can do. So there's communications that we have. That's why the tagline that we have is helping Filipino improve the lives of farm animals. So we're more invested on encouraging or capacitating the Philippines.
Yeah, I really love the the motto about how we are helping Filipinos help animals. Yeah, thank you so much, Kate. I learned a lot about the Philippines and animal welfare there. Especially I was interested in the work that you do with the government, a lot of the scoping reports that you publish on alternative proteins. I think that one of the things, obviously, that a lot of organizations are struggling with is just having enough knowledge to actually, action some of the things that they've always been wanting to do. And I just think that in the next few years, we will definitely see more of that coming through. And yeah, thank you
Yeah.
so much for all that you do for animals.
Thank you, thank you. If I could add just one thing about the report is, I think one thing that also good to highlight is the report is made by the Filipinos, so it's really like people who are in living here in the Philippines, because I think it's good to also understand what once we are like looking into the reports or like trying to read some of the reports, where do those knowledge really come from? So is it based from outside or is it really based on the people who live and that's their daily life? So yeah, so that's a very good way to end the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute joy having you.
Thank you.